Right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to get logged on. Hope everyone's having a good start to their Thursday. We'll look to start the session at about 5 minutes past the hour, just so that everyone can get in and log on. Always be nice at this time when we're waiting for people to come in if we can have some mood music, right, Katie?
Depends on what it is, I think.
I was listening to the radio on the way into the city today, and they were talking about your favourite show tune. So I was like, oh gosh, I probably have a few of those. Could probably put in put in a request.
Yeah, we should have done a playlist that had the word green in each song.
Oh, would have been a good idea. It's Not Easy Being Green is my favourite one by Kermit the Frog. Self on mute while we wait for a few more people to join in.
Yep.
A massive thanks to people who have joined on time. It's fantastic for you to join the session today. We're just going to wait for a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. All right, I see a few more people have joined. We're going to start in about 1 minute. So make yourself comfortable. Make sure you've got a cup of tea, cup of coffee. And you'll notice everybody's phone or connection is set to mute. You can raise questions, and we'll also be coming off mute at the end when we have a Q&A session. Alrighty. Okay. Well, thank you for everyone for joining us. We will kick off now. I'd like to welcome you all and start by doing an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and pay respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, whose ancestral lands and waters we work and live on throughout Australia. In Perth, which is where I'm sitting today, we're on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. We honour the wisdom and pay respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the cultural authority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across Australia. So my name is Marita. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Greenwashing Red Flags. A couple of logistical items. As I said, you guys are on mute at the moment. We'll bring you off mute or enable you to take yourself off mute at the end, so you can ask questions when we have a Q&A, but absolutely feel free to use the chat and the Q&A buttons throughout the session. This session will be recorded, and at the end of today, we'll send that out to all the participants along with the slideshow that we're going to be going through today. So by way of introduction, as I said, my name is Marita. I come from a transformation technology background of over 25 years plus. And I started with Net Zero, well over a year ago now to use my passion for helping businesses to improve the way they operate, but with a new focus on sustainability. I joined Net Zero because that's exactly what we do. For over 16 years, the team of sustainability experts have been helping businesses understand and improve their usage and emissions in areas like water, waste, electricity, gas, refrigerants, and make better operational decisions to decarbonise their businesses and to transition into a more sustainable way of working. I think today's topic is really important for a number of reasons, but key among them is that many of us out there are wanting to do the right thing. We've put a lot of time and energy into ensuring that our products and services are as sustainable as possible, and we want to communicate that to our stakeholders. So, whether that's employees, investors, customers, potential customers. But as we'll see today, we do need to be careful and I guess think about the words that we use and the evidence that we have to back up our claims. Now, greenwashing's been around for many years, but it seems like it's in our face a lot more. The prevalence of companies making claims that can't be backed up with evidence has grown as I guess companies are trying to differentiate themselves in a really competitive market. But what we want to do today is give you the confidence to tell your story. We want to encourage you to not be put off by the bad actors, but to make sure you've got the confidence that with the right planning and the right data, you're going to be able to tell the market about the sustainable aspects of your products and your services. Now, I'm really excited today to be joined by Katie, whose brain we're going to be picking to make sure that we can amplify the message of the great work that you're doing with your products and services, and to avoid the greenwashing claims by, being aware of the red flags, the pitfalls, and the language that we need to use about our current claims and our future base claims. So I'm going to hand over to Katie now to do a quick introduction before we dive in. Katie?
Thank you. Thanks, Marita. I'm also on Whadjuk Noongar land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise the centrality of First Nations wisdom to the practice of sustainability. I work in sustainability because I believe that the corporate sector has enormous potential to influence social and environmental outcomes. But a lot of that potential is untapped, and it is hard to make progress for companies. So I set up Just Progress to help companies to move forward, to focus on what matters, to take meaningful action, and to report their actions and progress in a way that is accurate and clear. Now, Marita, you talked about the explosion in the prevalence of greenwashing. And on the one hand, it's brilliant that as a society, we increasingly value sustainable business practice. We're also increasingly expecting companies to play their part. And I think that for you as companies, the challenge is twofold. First of all, as a company, you have to decide what actions are you going to take in response to the climate crisis? And then you have to find ways to communicate the actions that you're taking, your goals, and your environmental impact in a way that is clear and is accurate and stands up to scrutiny. Now, as Marita said, we don't want this session to be all about horrendous risk and to send you all running for cover. We want to emphasize that you can rise to this challenge, and we want to encourage you to take action. So in that spirit of progress and taking action, we have a couple of questions. We're going to do a quick survey using, I think, the chat function, just to ask you what actions your companies are already taking or what you might be thinking about taking. So I'll hand over to Marita, who can run these questions, and please just get your fingers at the ready to type in some answers in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Katie. So for the first question is, who's actually calculating their carbon footprint? So as an organization, just and type into the chat, yes or no, just as a way of understanding where people are. I see that one person has definitely said that they are, and I happen to know that person. So our organisation, so Net Zero, is actually starting to, and has done for the last number of years. I see there's a number of people starting to, yes. Um, Look, knowing your carbon footprint is a great place to start. Often when you're trying to figure out, what targets to set, it's really important to know where you are at the beginning. So knowing your carbon footprint to begin with is really great. So getting a number of yeses here. So that's really good. Second question is, who has sustainability content on their website or are putting it into their tenders? And again, having sustainability content on the websites is a great way of communicating to the broader stakeholder what your ambitions are. I'm just seeing thing come through now, yeses and nos. And today we're going to really talk about some of the language that is good to use to make sure that these statements are specific and clear and have supportable evidence. Okay, cool. Thanks for getting some information through. And the last question before we get into the session today is really around the communication aspect. Who's actually reporting on ESG, so environment, social, and governance. So we have ESG section in our report, in our annual report, and that's actually a good point because some organisations are reporting on ESG in a standalone sustainability report. Others are putting it as a section um, in their annual report. What is really critical is to make sure that those sustainability statements are consistent across all mediums. And as we'll learn today, that we use language that's very specific. Okay, so we're going to kick into the session today and start picking Katie's brain on this topic. But thanks very much for your input there. So, Katie, to set the scene a bit, it would be great to get some examples of where companies have faced allegations of greenwashing and particularly where those allegations have been upheld.
Yeah, sure. So when a company engages in greenwashing, it misrepresents the extent to which its product or its activity or its service is environmentally friendly or sustainable. And greenwashing can come up in statements that leave out or omit key information, or statements that distort the true picture, or statements that are straight out false. Now, I know that in the invitation to this webinar, we mentioned two examples. So I'm going to start with those and then I'll give you a couple more. So first up, we have Dieselgate. This is the Volkswagen emissions scandal. I'm sure everyone knows about it. It had worldwide impact. It broke in 2015. And what happened was that certain types of Audis and Volkswagens had been fitted with emissions tracking technology that made the cars look less polluting than they were. So that was fraud, that was malpractice, but there was also a greenwashing aspect to it because the cars were marketed as cleaner and greener than alternatives. In some places, they even had adverts using our friend Kermit the Frog to promote their green nature. Now, that's an example of statements that are false. It's straight out deception, straight out naughtiness. It resulted in a penalty, a record penalty in Australia for Volkswagen of 125 million in action taken by the regulator ACCC, and also many legal actions all over the world that frankly kept the legal community busy for almost a decade. So that's Dieselgate. What about the Vanguard case? That's a recent case in Australia. It's also the first win by another regulator, ASIC, that was seeking civil penalties against a company for greenwashing. So it's a little bit of a record breaker as well. Vanguard is an investment manager, and they offered a ethically conscious index fund. And that fund claimed to apply certain ESG exclusionary screens. In other words, what it claimed was that screens were applied so that the fund did not hold investments that had connections with certain types of activities like fossil fuels. In reality, the fund did hold those types of investments because the ESG research and the screening simply hadn't happened. It hadn't been conducted. Unsurprisingly, Vanguard accepted in court that these statements were false and misleading. What gets interesting is when this case goes back to the court next month, because the level of penalty for Vanguard is going to be decided. But for now, I think the message really couldn't be simpler. If you're making statements about your environmental credentials and impact, make sure that what you're saying is true. What we've just looked at, two examples where clearly it wasn't true, but I think the situation can be much more complicated and nuanced than that. So I want to give another example, which is a statement with a qualifying statement or small print or a disclaimer. What happens then? And to give this example, I'm going to tell you a garbage bag story that is actually my story, because this is what I did. Now, thank you. Zach has popped up on the screen the brand of bin bags that caught my eye in Woolies. Glad to be green. It's a Clorox brand. At the time that it caught my eye because it said it was 50% ocean plastic recycled. And it also had the ocean plastic phrase there twice on the front. So I'm trying to make a decision about bin bags. I'm looking for recycled content. This one catches my eye because in my mind, I envision plastic being fished out of the sea. What I didn't do was read the back of that label, because on the back of the label, in slightly smaller print, it said that the plastic was taken from areas without a formal waste management system within 50 kilometers of the shoreline. So plastic was not being fished out of the sea, although it could have ended up in the sea if it hadn't have been recovered from these areas. Now, just in case we have someone on the call from Clorox, I should be absolutely clear that halfway through this story, they did update the branding and they changed the wording to say it was ocean-bound plastic rather than ocean plastic. But in any case, when I bought the bags, this is what they look like as you're looking on the screen. And I formed the overall impression that caused me to buy these bags, and that impression wasn't consistent with the small print. That's the basis on which the ACCC has brought enforcement action against Clorox, because they're alleging that Clorox misled consumers that the bag had 50% recycled plastic from the ocean, notwithstanding the small print on the back. Now, this brings up a question which you might be wondering already. Is Clorox at fault because I, with all my knowledge, failed to read the small print? Well, that question comes down to an objective one, because the question is not specifically what happened to me. The question is, would the reasonable person have been misled when you consider the whole context, everything that was contained in that statement? So it's an objective test that is set. And we don't have a ruling yet. The court's going to answer that question. But for now, I think the lesson that I'd like you to take from my sad ocean plastic story is this. It is a high-risk strategy to use the small print to deliver all of the relevant information to give an accurate picture. And if you're using a headline claim, then don't use the small print to rectify what is otherwise a misleading impression, because that is, as I say, high risk. So that's an example about putting detail into smaller print or qualifying statements. One more example, which is actually about whether you got the detail at all. This is an example concerning a listed company, and so the relevant regulator here is ASIC. Black Mountain Energy, a listed company, made ASX announcements that the company was creating a natural gas development project with net zero carbon emissions and carbon neutral gas. Now, at the time of making those claims, Black Mountain Energy hadn't done the work, hadn't done emissions modeling, and hadn't really done the work to demonstrate how that result would be achieved. The regulator ASIC issued an infringement notice, which is a fine, and Black Mountain Energy paid that on a no admissions basis for a fine of 40,000 or so. So it wasn't contested. So that's an example of a claim that's made without without the necessary substantiation, and we can dig into that a bit more, Marita, in a bit. But for now, I think what's the big takeaway here? Well, greenwashing is not just about making straight out false statements. It can take many forms, and there are nuances, and there are different ways to wash. It's not as simple as a straight out falsehood, and I think that's where the difficulty lies for companies in getting it right.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that even somebody as a keen observer like yourself can be misled, which is why I think there's such a massive focus being put on greenwashing, and why ASIC and ACCC are really, honing down on companies who are, actively, and sometimes not actively misleading companies and people, because we make our investment decisions based on that information. And in your case, it was a small investment decision, but others is not so small. So given these examples of how these companies have kind of overstated the product or misled or, omitted, how do regulatory bodies typically detect and prove cases of greenwashing?
Yeah, well, the two regulatory frameworks that are relevant are, first of all, consumer protection, and then the framework for corporate behavior in the context of financial services, so primarily listed companies. So we've got the Australian Consumer Law, and then we've got the Corporations Act and the ASIC Act, and they both have broad and very similar rules that prohibit engaging in conduct that's misleading or deceptive or likely to mislead or deceive. And as I've said, whether something is likely to mislead or deceive or be misleading or deceptive is an objective question. So you've got to look at the conduct as a whole, the entire context, and ask, would this mislead the reasonable person? Now, I think the really tricky thing when it comes to making claims about sustainability is that we're often concerned with outcomes in the future. We're often concerned with states that we want to achieve in the future. And this means that as companies, we're often making statements about future matters, or what's known as forward-looking statements. Particularly relevant if you think about making statements about your net zero commitments and your transition plans. What's the situation there? Well, the same general prohibition about misleading and deceptive conduct applies, and what the company needs is to have reasonable grounds for making the statement at the time the statement is made. And if you don't have those reasonable grounds, then it's going to be taken to be misleading or deceptive. So going back to the Black Mountain Energy example, they hadn't done the work at the time they made the statement to substantiate it. So it's neither here nor there whether, in the next couple of years, technology might have come along to actually get them that result. You've got to have that reasonable grounds at the time. But just to answer your question specifically about consequences, what happens? Well, on the regulatory side, as we've seen in those examples, you have the two regulators, the ACCC and ASIC, with broad investigative powers, so they can ask you questions, they can ask you to demonstrate what your evidence is, they can issue infringement notices or fines, and they can take court action seeking civil penalties, and do things like injunct you, so stop you from making those statements. On the private side, you can also face legal action potentially. brought by your shareholders, brought by your stakeholders, seeking to stop you or injunct you from repeating those claims, and seeking a declaration from the court that what you've said is misleading or deceptive. So that's all the legal stuff. But more broadly, there are serious reputational consequences for misleading when it comes to your environmental credentials. You think about the damage that can be wreaked upon your reputation, your relationships, your standing in the business community. And I think probably the thing that really bothers me the most about greenwashing is that it brings the good down with the bad, because generally greenwashing increases mistrust, it builds cynicism, it's damaging in every single way because companies that are doing meaningful work are disadvantaged, and other companies are simply discouraged from doing anything at all. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to dig into the detail of what the greenwashing risks are and do something about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because, as I said at the top, like a lot of people out there are really wanting to do the right thing, and I guess these laws are in place to protect the consumer. But at the end of the day, we're all running businesses, and we're trying to sell into the Australian market. And I guess many of us have invested quite heavily in the sustainability nature of our products and services, and we do want to shout it from the rooftops. And we've got our founders and we've got marketing people saying, let's push. We've got this green product, or we're going to get to net zero, and we're going to help you get to net zero. So there's a lot of people in the background saying, let's say this, let's not say this. But given, I guess, the legal ramifications and consequences you've just mentioned, like how do we really go about promoting our products and our green credentials?
Yeah, and this is where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? So, in many ways, there's no trick to it. It's actually really easy, because apply common sense, be ethical, tell the truth, and have the evidence to back up what you're saying. And I think that's what, if you look at the ACCC's 8 principles, they have issued guidance on avoiding greenwashing, and they've summarized that guidance in the form of these 8 principles that we're looking at on the slide. And when you read those, it really does look very simple. Of course, everyone's going to do this, right? We're all going to apply these kind of ethical and common sense principles. But when you look at, of course, the examples, it's nowhere near that simple, and the devil's really in the detail. And we'll dig into that a bit more about what exactly do you need. But to stay at the very, very high level and to try and give you just some general tips based on what I see. I can probably summarize them into four things. And the first one is avoid using words that suggest that your company is some kind of planetary saint. And by that, I mean, avoid using terms like eco-friendly, climate-friendly, good for the environment, good for the planet. Every company has negative environmental impacts. No one can claim to be a saint. So I really, really encourage you to avoid that kind of terminology. My next tip is be really specific. Now, if you look at principle 5 on the slide, it says avoid broad and unqualified claims. I think you can be more direct. I think you just say be specific. And I think we can dig into that one a little bit more in a moment, Marita. The next one is about trying to follow a set of leading standards. Now, the example that I would give here is a relatively new global standard called ISSB, IFRS sustainability standards. You may have heard of those because they are the ones that are going to be used to introduce mandatory climate reporting for large companies in Australia fairly soon. Now, why do I say that? The reason I say that is if you follow those standards to structure what you say, it will also require you to use specific concepts, to use particular metrics, and to follow a particular methodology to work out what your material issues are. and then how to structure what you say about them. So it's a very rigorous methodology that you are going to have to follow if you apply that set of standards. And then the last tip that I'd say is to tackle your blind spots. We all have blind spots when it comes to how we describe our company's work and what we say. Get an objective view, test it with a third party, because that will give you really important information about whether the overall impression that's created is one that is accurate or not. And in particular, if you want to look at headline claims versus small print and qualifying statements, I think you have to get that tested objectively to try and get that kind of impression. So we will circulate, I think, the links to not only the ACCC's guidance, but also there is ASIC guidance, which is a must read if you are listed, and some of the other things that we're going to refer to. But I'll hand back to you, Marita.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, in a nutshell, it's like be truthful, have evidence to back up your claim, don't overstate, don't hide, don't omit information, don't use visual images that give the wrong impression. But I think that, if we dive into maybe point two, have evidence to back up your claims, because I think, what you've said before about using a leading standard, like having a framework or a methodology as your grounding point is really relevant. And making sure that we have, use specific language and specific statements. But I guess, what does evidence look like, in terms of how do we demonstrate a product or a service or an organization, in terms of what evidence do we need?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really, really important question. So it's not just about having evidence, it's about the quality and the detail of that evidence. And I want to use a case against KLM to try and give you an example here. So on the slide, you'll see this. This is a billboard that was used by KLM as part of their marketing campaign to fly responsibly. And KLM, which is a Dutch-based airline, they ended up in the Amsterdam court, who ruled that KLM had misled customers. Now, there's lots of different aspects to this case, but the bit that I want to look at is the bit where KLM was using the term fly CO2 zero or fly carbon zero. And what they were doing is that they encouraged you to book your flight and pay an extra amount to compensate for the emissions from your flight. And that amount that you were paying would be put towards the purchase of sustainable aviation fuel and funding a tree planting program. Now, it wasn't in doubt that KLM was using a certain amount of sustainable aviation fuel and funding a tree planting program. The evidence was there that they were taking these steps. The problem was the lack of evidence that you, the passenger, got to wipe out all of the CO2 emissions personally attributed to your little part of the flight by those particular steps. There wasn't a direct link between the extra money that you paid and the impact, and no evidence that the tree planting would reabsorb the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions from the flight, and a lack of evidence that the minimal use of sustainable aviation fuel by KLM would mean that flying was now carbon zero. So in relation to those aspects, KLM was found to have misled the customer with these statements. So that's a specific example, and you'll all probably be aware that KLM are not the only ones to use these kinds of mechanisms. In fact, I think it's pretty rife across the entire aviation industry. But if we zoom back out, what are we really trying to say about evidence here? Well, we're saying the evidence needs to be specific, it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to be objectively credible. So broadly, what do you look for to help you to give you some comfort that you're going to meet those standards, well, look for standards set by an independent, globally recognized body and try and follow those. Look for and rely on peer-reviewed research and science-based methodologies. Now, probably still sounds really abstract. I think what we want to do is show you an example using a methodology called LCA to give you the specific example of where you can get evidence at the necessary level of detail. Now, I am by no means an LCA expert, but I know people who are, so I'm going to hand over to Marita to cover this bit.
And just to be clear as well, I'm not an LCA expert, but the team at Net Zero are. So I've learned a lot in the last year and a half of working with the team. So LCA is a life cycle assessment, and on the screen here now we can see New Zealand king salmon. And I think what Katie's talked about before is being specific. A life cycle assessment is very specific. So it sets the boundaries about what you're assessing. And in this instance, we're talking about the very beginning of the life cycle of this product, all the way through to the consumption of this product. So in here, it's called a cradle to grave assessment. So it takes into account, how the product starts its life, all the processing, and then how it's destructed and its end of life as well. And you can see on the right hand side here, bringing back to another one of Katie's points, it is using specific standards to anchor its statements. And so it's very clear, again, what the boundaries are, what the methodologies or frameworks that are being used to make the calculations and the statements. So it's specific. It's using, some methodologies that are well established. And if you jump onto the next screen, Zach, you've got a lot of information here around what is included so that you can actually go and follow up and get a lot more detail on what claims they're actually making. So I think that this is just another example of the fact that, it is more about the fact that we can demonstrate the quality of your claims and have evidence to back up so that you can see what the claims are based on. So moving on to the next question, and you raised something earlier, Katie, around that a lot of our statements are future-based or forward-looking statements. And it does seem to be almost impossible to make accurate claims about what hasn't, yet happened. There can be so much uncertainty around, anything from technology to, other external factors and how sectors are going to be able to transition to net zero, what technology they're going to be able to leverage, etc. And companies want to be able to make net zero commitments, but also kind of, I guess we worry about how much detail we need to be able to make those claims. So do you have any suggestions with respect to those future looking statements and the way that we can transition and plan for that transition?
Yeah. And look, let's just be clear here. This is without doubt the trickiest part. I think, and it's very, very challenging, and there's a lot of companies grappling with this at the moment, and they'll continue to grapple with it. Just to bring it back to the basics, the legal position, you need a reasonable basis for the statements you're making at the time you make them, and if you don't have that reasonable basis, then you're risking making a false or a misleading claim. Putting that into practice when it comes to your net zero commitment and your transition plan is hard, as I've said, but I don't think it's impossible. Now, there's an increasing amount of guidance and standards that you can seek to rely on. The ones that I would particularly highlight are the UN's high-level expert group in a report called Integrity Matters. We'll circulate that link. That really is the gold standard. And then a sort of more practical corporate-facing report by the non-profit Ceres. So we will send those out to you so you can have a read. There is also the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they have a corporate net zero standard. And that remains, I think, the leading source of information and standard. It also, if you meet it, gives you validation. So the SBTI will validate your net zero plan. Before you do any of this, you need to know what your baseline is, what your emissions are, before you dive into your transition plan. You need to know what you've got at the moment and what the extent of the challenge is. So that's always going to be step one. But after that, there is guidance available to help you work through the rest.
Yeah, and I think that from the poll earlier, a number of you have already started looking at your carbon footprint, so you're well on the way. I think one of the final questions I wanted to ask, and it's we've presented a lot of information here, and I guess many of the organisations that we're working with and talking to have either a very small sustainability team, one person wearing multiple hats, or no sustainability team at all. So, what kind of skills should we be looking for internally to help us out with, I guess, with on this journey? Are there skill sets that actually make them a better fit for being able to, build our plan, make sure that we've got the strategy in place, make sure that we've got the data and whatever we need to repeat as we build out our services and products. And then if we don't have them internally, how should we be looking to grow them?
Yeah. Yep. And yeah, the skill set issue I think is a really live issue, and I know a lot of companies are talking about that at the moment and worried about it. I think if you are a really small company, I still think you can rise to these challenges. What you need more than anything else, what you need is a mindset that orients to detail. And I think we've probably emphasized that throughout this session today. The detail is key. You have to be specific. You have to chase down the right methodology, the right set of standards, and have that rigorous approach. So in many ways, it's not so much the technical expertise, but it's that mindset that I think is the single most important thing in terms of being able to address these issues. If you're a bit bigger, and you have a number of different people who can help you with this kind of exercise, then what you want to try and do is that multidisciplinary, multifunctional approach. So ideally, what you're looking for, if you're building out a strategy and then how you're going to talk about that in the market, you need input from operations, you need input from finance, from communications, from risk, across the board, really. And if you're lucky enough to have a sustainability expert, then of course that person's going to be central to that too. So there are different ways, and it's very, very much a case of, what size are you and what can you manage. I think without doubt, there are issues that would benefit from external help and advice. And that might be sometimes just helping you cut through the complexity, helping you get started. And then once you work through what your particularly challenging areas are, then you might then need to look again for some external help. And I think you and I both agree, Marita, that we very much believe that sustainability needs to be sustainable. You can't just outsource all of this. You cannot, I don't think, afford to consistently outsource. But what you can aim for is that continual improvement in honing your skills and making yourself more mature in your approach to sustainability. The last thing I'd say is about external assurance, because I think that's really important to cover. There is already a practice amongst large listed companies. There's already a voluntary practice of getting third-party external assurance for your environmental claims, often also your social claims. it is a live issue that is going to become very, very important when mandatory climate reporting comes in, because that will involve, over the next 5 years or so, the imposition of requirements to get not just third-party assurance, but working up to full audit. And that third-party view, when I was talking about tackling your blind spots, that third-party view, of course, is going to give you some comfort that you're not being too subjective in what you're saying, and that you have applied the sufficient level of rigor and controls to the evidence that you've got and how you're presenting it. So there's a range of different skills, I think, there for you to think about, but the devil's in the detail. This is about words, and words matter, and data matters. So I think that's my key takeaway.
Yeah, and I think what one kind of aspect to what I've seen is this is a team sport. So, having people across your organization and not having it siloed in one area is really critical, because we're looking at, the procurement process, we're looking at HR, we're looking at finance, we're looking at communication. So all of those, parts of your organization will have a place to play with making sure that all the statements that are going external, but also internal, are, I guess, sung from the single song sheet, and that they have the clarity and the evidence to back them up. So yeah, I think that the one thing that I've learned, I guess in being in business, is silos don't work. So having that team sport aspect to making sure that you're achieving your objective is really critical. So I might just open up the floor now and see if there are any questions from our audience. So Zach, I'm not sure if you can enable the people to unmute. Feel free to put questions in the chat if you don't want to come off unmute, or if it's too loud in your background to do so. But would really love to hear some of your questions. So Zach's saying mics are enabled. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask us a question, please come off mute now or pop a question in the chat. Okay, I think we have a question coming through. Not yet, no. So while you guys are thinking of questions yourself, as I always say to Katie, I could quiz her on aspects for a long time. I think we have talked about some of the potential consequences for companies that engage in greenwashing, and you talked about reputation. But in terms of financial, is there some guidelines that people can see with regards to financial impacts as well?
Yeah. So I mentioned the ACCC guidance. There's a little section at the back of that talks about the penalties that they could impose. The amount ranges, and it depends on the nature of the conduct, and also how many times it was repeated, and so on and so forth. But as a sort of broad guide, for a company, it can go up to 50 million or 30% of annual turnover. So quite significant. I think the Volkswagen case, the penalty there that the ACCC got was 125 million. So, these are not insignificant sums of money. If you're listed and you're facing a civil penalty action by ASIC, then again, it ranges, but it's around 15 million or 10% potentially of annual turnover that is capped at about 780 million. So it's pretty hefty. And then you've got the infringement notices, the fines. So the example that we looked at with Black Mountain Energy, that was a fine of just under 40,000. So these are significant amounts of money, and I think zooming out though, it's not so much the risk from a liability perspective in terms of penalties. I think it's the reputational damage that everyone needs to be mindful of. Regulatory action doesn't happen all the time against all companies that make greenwashing or misleading claims. The regulators have to be very choosy about the actions that they take. But reputational damage, I think, can happen in any situation.
Yeah, we do have a question in here. What resources and tools are available to help consumers verify the environmental claims of products? So again, it's understanding, some of the frameworks that are being used to back up the claims. There is a bit of research in it. As you said, the KLM example that you provided earlier, there is ways to check out and do a bit of research yourself. When it comes to products, it's looking at the environmental product disclosure statements, which are available online. Katie, any other, I guess, tools that you would suggest for consumers like yourself falling into the bin bag issue? Like, how could you have identified things like that?
Yeah. I mean, the obvious thing to say there is I could have read the back of the label. But we're all busy. We don't really always have time to investigate exactly what the small print is trying to tell us, and also it's mind-boggling. This is a minefield. There are endless amounts of new claims popping up, different types of terms being used, and you really almost need a PhD to be able to work through exactly whether something is indeed credible and accurate or not. I think it's always helpful to, as you say, to think about what does the company mean when they use a term like climate friendly? What does a company mean when they use a term like carbon neutral? What independent verification are they trying to rely on here or pointing to? If they're not pointing to anything, then that I think needs to give you a little bit of a warning. Um, there's also, I mean, if you feel particularly aggrieved in relation to something that you buy or use and then subsequently discover isn't quite what you thought it was, there is the Ad Standards Agency. It is part of the self-regulation of advertising, and you can make a complaint to Ad Standards about being misled. And whilst they're not a regulator, they can and they will follow up with the company. And I think we've got in the materials that we're going to send out, we've got a link to the code, the environmental code that Ad Standards has, which can help you just kind of understand whether what the company has said is acceptable or not. So yeah, there are different ways. I don't want to say to people be cynical, mistrust, because that's exactly what we want to avoid. But
Mm.
I think to the extent that you can try and get a little bit more information and be a little bit wiser, then that's a good thing.
I've got a question here. If you've made unsubstantiated claims, what advice would you give in approaching a retraction of these claims? It's a great
Yeah,
question.
that's a really good question. So if you're listed and let's say circumstances arise that change what you have already stated, and this is, I think, really relevant with a net zero commitment or a transition plan, um, then actually as part of your disclosure obligations, you should be coming out to the market as fast as possible and correcting that or updating it or making a further statement. The regulators accept that circumstances can change. This is inherently a complex situation. It's fast moving, as we know. So circumstances change, and it's acceptable to acknowledge that circumstances have changed and to correct that to the market. On the other hand, if what's uncovered is something that was always going to be unsubstantiated. So it's not so much a change of circumstances, but you discover that what was said last year or the year before simply had no evidential basis or reasonable grounds. Then that's a trickier situation. I mean, you're probably picking up the phone to the lawyer at that point. But having said that, you still have to do something to rectify it. So understand the best avenue to do that, and then take that avenue as fast as you can. I think you're on mute, Marita.
Sorry, yeah. We had a customer who had we'd identified something on their website which was unsubstantiated, and that we got them to take that down and alter that. So I think that was not being misleading on purpose, but again, just didn't think through the ramifications. So I think, thank you for the question that's come through. We've got 5 minutes left, so I might wrap it up here. Give you guys a couple more minutes left in your day. But I think it feels like it boils down to really having a credible basis for your claim. There are frameworks that we use that work and that are well established and can guide you. But I think we've kind of stated, but getting started, knowing exactly where you are to begin with, like an as-is statement is the best way to figure out how you can transition and what is achievable. So I hope that today we've been able to point out some of the red flags and how to avoid them. But most importantly, to demonstrate that you can do this yourself by really understanding the boundaries, understanding what data you have and what you can report on, so that you can really actually achieve what you're saying that you're going to achieve. A massive thanks to Zach behind the scenes, but to Katie for answering all of our questions. So over to you, Katie, to final words.
Yeah, thank you. So I started in the beginning of this session by saying, you've got this challenge. First of all, decide what your company's going to do to respond to the climate crisis, and then figure out how you're going to communicate what you're doing, what your progress is, in a way that is accurate and stands up to scrutiny. It's not easy, but it can be done. And you can figure out what your priorities are and build a strategy around them. And each company's got massive potential to make a difference and to make progress. And the last thing I'd say is I think you risk more if you run away from this challenge than if you rise to it. So let's get to it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. And we will be sending out the slides, which have got some links to them as well at the end. Have a great rest of your afternoon. And look forward to hearing about the progress you're making and not seeing you on the front page of the newspaper anywhere. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.